Hopefully it's better when it's quiet. Okay, guys, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I kind of ran out of time last time, so we're going to get this going. So to introduce myself, my name is Miranda Walz, and I live in the Kansas City area. I work for a Steelcase dealership there. Been there for about 3.5 years. I've been using CET for around 3 years. And just to kind of get a feel, who's been using CET for more than 3 years? A lot of you. Okay. So maybe in turn you can teach me a few things too, but I am going to start with my few tips and tricks on typical renderings. I know there's another session on those day-to-day renderings, but I'm just going to kind of show you what I like to do for them, and then we'll get into kind of more full outfitted spaces and how I set those up, and then we'll go into PhotoLab. But I think it's important to talk about how you set up your drawing space. I think that's the biggest key to make you successful in PhotoLab. So we'll spend some time on that. For me, I think the 3 key things for successful renderings are materials, which depending on your client, sometimes you don't have as much freedom, so you're stuck with what you get. And then accessories and lighting, of course. So I drew up these 2 couple typicals here, and typically I don't accessorize this much, but I just wanted to show you what that looks like. So accessorizing can take a lot of time. So if you don't have a lot of time but still want to accessorize your workspace, the 3 things I always like to do are some type of monitor, whether it's a tablet or a PC, a coffee mug, and then some type of like stack of papers or a file folder just for that 3rd accessory. And then if I do have an open bookshelf, I like to at least fill up a couple of the shelves just to show like the depth of that bookcase so it doesn't seem so flat and dark. All right. So my biggest tip for successful typical renderings is what your floor is. So I'm just going to kind of show you these 2 renderings that I did. And you can see the one on the right has substance at the bottom. The one on the left just looks like it's floating in space. So depending on what your flooring is, sorry, I got like a crash on my last presentation, so I had to restart my drawings, and so I should have been loading this. I forgot. How many of you are super experienced with Material Explorer and Material Lab? Okay, but like you've used them, you know how to get there and like pick a material and paint and like all of that. Okay, I had a range in the last class, so I had to go into a little bit more detail, but if I don't have to with you guys, that'll save us some time. All right. So typically with floors, so I always paint that default carpet that comes in. And I always used to, and I'll show you when it loads, but in Material Explorer, I always used to just search floor and use that white default floor. I feel like sometimes that can be a little bit too reflective for my liking, but I used it for a long time, probably till about like 6 months ago. I know my biggest fear is technology not working, so hopefully it doesn't crash on you guys. Okay, so I always used to just search that floor and use this white floor here. Since then, I have found I actually use a stone floor. So I go down to stone, and I go all the way to the bottom to stone 126. And that is the flooring that you saw in this rendering. So I like that it doesn't have a lot of reflection to it, but it still gives that subtle shadow. It makes the typical grounded. If you do, however, want to add a little bit more reflection to it, that's when you can have this material selected, open PhotoLab, you can manipulate the reflection, anything there, and then you can save as that material, however you edited it, and it will come back into Material Explorer. And this is the one I did in the last class, so this is stone floor reflection. I just turned up the reflection a little bit. So you can do that here, turn up the reflection. I want to save as, and then it saves as that GM file, and it brings it right back into Material Explorer. My next thing with typicals, because it's not enclosed, I don't focus a lot on lighting. However, if I have a lot of open bookshelves like this, I find that those can render super dark inside. So how do you get lighting in there without it being overwhelming for all of the other product in your space? So I use a spotlight, which is in the 3D tab here. And every time, let me split this here so you guys can see. Okay. So every time you bring in a spotlight, it's going to orbit around that X. And you're going to have to, every time you bring it in, you can see it kind of is shooting at the floor, so you're going to have to adjust your elevation and target elevation every time. A workaway around that I found is I like to save these little lighting things as favorites to bring them in. However, if you bring in a favorite spotlight, you're still going to have to reset that target elevation and elevation. So my workaround for that is I set it the way I want to here. I made it a block. And then when you save that block as a favorite, and even if you copy and paste in the same drawing, if you don't have it as a block, it's going to save your light settings, but not your elevation. But if you save it as a block, copy and paste, bring it in as a favorite, that elevation is going to stick. So if let me go back. Let me just explode this block just to kind of show you what that's doing. So I did the target elevation to hit around those bookcases, and then I used these nodes and really spread it out because I wanted it to hit all of it. Light settings. So I think the default comes in around 300. Just through experience, I found all the default lights typically come in super bright. So for me, through experience, I just know I automatically bring that brightness down. And then the only other thing I do in light settings for this type of application is I turn shadows off. If I'm doing like a ceiling, yes, I want that ceiling to create natural shadows, but if I'm just producing general light throughout the space, I don't want it to be obvious where that light source is coming from, so I want to turn those shadows off. So those are my couple little setups for typical renderings.
What level do you take your brightness down to?
So typically, and you'll kind of see differences throughout my presentation, but typically I start between 100 and 200, and it depends how many of those types of light sources I have in my space. You'll see some later on that are above 200, but this one, I like the way it looked at 188 it is. And if you move this like node up and down, and if you know there's like a setting that you really like, you can always type it in if you can't get to it with your scrolly bar. So to show you that rendering, so this deep bookcase is still a little dark because it's 24 inches deep. It was a custom bookcase, but you can see how like the inside of that lighting is hitting the inside of those bookcases a little bit better. It's still a little bit dark, and then you can see those shadows on the floor for that. Okay. So I'm just going to touch on a little bit on PhotoLab for this. There's not a lot of customization I do in PhotoLab for my typicals, but I'll show you what I do. First, I want to point out this quick render tool. It wasn't so quick in the last session, so I won't do that. Sorry, there's like a lag between my mouse and what's actually happening, so bear with me. But you can use this quick render tool. I always default to product lighting. Product lighting is good for just general product. It was designed to highlight specific product. So I always default to that, and then you can hit this quick render tool, and it will render exactly this view that's in my 3D. Just to give, especially if you do have an enclosed space, that's really nice just to get a feel for what your lighting's doing instead of spending like 5 minutes rendering. You can do a quick render, get a feel for what your lights are doing, and then adjust before you get into PhotoLab. The other thing about PhotoLab I like to point out before I get there is this, I don't know the actual name for it, I call it the snip to PhotoLab, but it just allows you to select anything you want to take to PhotoLab. That way you don't have to worry about anything in the background. Ignore my panorama, we'll get to that later.
When you snip to PhotoLab,
Yeah, so let me try, so if I snip this one, there it is. Okay. So yes, it will continue to add on. If you decide, oh, I don't want that snip anymore, you can try to grab it in here. Sometimes that's a little hard. I typically just right-click on my thumbnail, remove 3D clipping, and then that goes away. Okay. I didn't mean to cancel out of that. Let's go back. So for typical renderings in Photolab, let me get to simple mode. So it defaults to normal mode. Like I mentioned about product lighting, I always default there. And then these presets that Photolab has for you, they do have their own light settings already attached to them. So I always start with that. And then I'll go to advanced if I do need to switch anything. And I'll go into more detail about what all these functions are when we do like the full rendering space. But the ones that I want to point out for my typical renderings is I always like to do my image dimensions a little bit wider. I think the default is like a 4:3, so it's more square. I default to this 1080 pixels here. I just think rectangular is a little bit more pleasing to the eye. It gives you more flexibility with your space, and then if you don't need that extra, you can crop it out in post-processing. But that's what I default to there. And then the only other two things I do for typical renderings is I don't really mess with it here, but you can see when your elevation changes over there. And for most of my renderings, if I can, I like to keep this elevation between like 5'6" and 8 feet just to give it that more realistic. Sometimes 8 feet looks fine, depending on your space. 8 feet can even look unrealistic, but I try to stick around that range. And then the only other thing I do for typical renderings is keep this outline overlay on. If I do need to ghost something, you can't use outline overlay. And actually a gentleman came up to me after the last session and said that outline overlay isn't available on all computers. Do all of you have outline overlay? Okay, okay. Yeah, I didn't know that, but I like to use outline overlay. If I do need to ghost something for some reason, like if I need to ghost out this desk to see through the bookcase, I can select. You know, so you can select your objects there that you want to ghost out. Okay. And then for post-processing, with these, typically that product lighting does everything for me. There might be some times where I do need to bring up the brightness a little bit. I was hoping some of these would stay, but. Okay, this one stayed. So sometimes I will still need to bring up that brightness. And then if you bring down the exposure, I typically just mess with that for enclosed spaces. But that's where you can play around with that. And then the only other thing in here is I do mess around with that outline overlay. So you can kind of see if I bring that all the way up, what's that doing? It's defining all those spaces. I think this is useful for like this type of application. My storage is all really dark. So using the outline overlay to define what those pieces are. So you can mess with the weight of that, the opacity, and the line thickness. Any questions on like just typicals before I move into a full space? Okay, so I'm going to switch drawings. So I wanted to show you guys, so I don't know if you've seen this rendering, but this is the one I submitted last year for the competition. So I just wanted to go through my model space and talk about how I set that up to make this successful in Photolab. I will say you saw another like enclosed space in that other drawing. I've learned a lot in a year from what I did here and what I did there, but I also learned that there's more than one way to do things. So I want to kind of show you my techniques through this one and maybe that'll work best for you, and then I'll show you a few different techniques for the next one. Because I always thought I didn't know what I was doing, but it worked, so. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about in this model space is, first of all, you can see it doesn't look that polished. This exposed ceiling is coming all the way out, but that doesn't matter because the end product worked out. So I want to talk about lighting first. Lighting was a little bit difficult in this one just because it was my first time really doing like a full outfitted rendering, so it was a lot of trial and error. Somebody asked me in the last class how long this took me, and because I was learning everything I did, setting up my model space and all the practice renderings I did, I probably spent around 25 hours on this, but I want you to know this is not my day-to-day. I do not put this much time into everything, but of course, I had fun with the competition and juiced it up. So, lighting tips for this. You can see that I have this exposed ceiling. I don't have any actual CET lights in my ceiling. So the first thing I did is I brought in these exposed bulb light fixtures through SketchUp. And anything you bring in through SketchUp typically doesn't have a light glowing off of it. So what I did is I use Edit Graphics a lot. And depending on the symbol, you don't always have to make it editable to paint it. Project symbols and catalog symbols, you can typically just paint. Smart tools, you can't, but you can if you make it editable. Then you can paint the individual meshes. So for these lights, it's hard to see in like the 3D space, but I don't think this is the exact one, but I found like a faint yellow and painted that bulb just to make it look like it was glowing. And I'll refer back to this so you can kind of see. So it looks like they have some light behind them instead of just like a faint bulb. The next thing for lighting, I did the same for this light fixture. Even though I had light turned on, it wasn't actually giving off any light that I could tell. So again, I edited this graphic and then I painted just the outside there to make it look like that was glowing. And you can kind of see that in the background. The other thing with lighting, I still found through my practice renderings that my ceiling was really dark, and it does have a darker finish on it. So what I used was the rectangular area lights in the Lightings tab here. I've since learned different techniques, but at this time, I just kind of spread that out throughout my whole space. Still found it wasn't enough, so I put in a second one. With that first one, I found that it was lighting the walls coming down really well, but it wasn't lighting the center of my space as well, so that's why I brought in this second layer. I brought the elevation down a little bit and then made it a little bit smaller just to get more light in the center of my rendering. Another thing I did just to give general lighting in my space was I used these Omni lights and I placed them throughout. I don't do that a lot with my renderings anymore, but for this one it worked. Just because I didn't have that natural CET light coming down, this was a good general lighting. And for my Omni lights, also I found out they came in really bright, so I turned them down a little bit, and then I saved that as a favorite. So now if I need to light a space, I can bring in that favorite, and my settings are there, my elevation's there. So this one is actually at 261. So maybe I didn't have as many lights for this. If I had a lot more, I would probably bring that brightness down again. Okay, the next thing for lighting I want to talk about is window lights that you can find in your 3D tab. I didn't have a lot of experience with window lights when I did this, and I found that they just came in way too bright, and I just wasn't successful at controlling them. So what I did for this one is I put spotlights in my windows. So I just made them pointing down to the floor, turned down the brightness just so it looked like that sunlight was coming in. And you can see that in the floor of that rendering here. All right, I think that was all the lighting I did in here. Any questions about lighting for this space? Okay. The next thing I want to talk about in this space is this background image. You saw my panorama in PhotoLab before, so there's a background feature in PhotoLab that we'll get into. At the time, I didn't know how to use that, so what I did is I just Googled a skyline image that I liked, and you guys are going to laugh at me, but I didn't even know what to do with that. So pretend this is the image I found. I snipped about what I thought the size of this window was. I saved this snippet tool, brought it into Material Lab, adjusted the height and width the way I needed to, and I painted my window. So, and then I turned down the opacity too, so it still looked like it was in a distance. It looked like the sun was coming through, so I turned that opacity down. And that's how I created that background. Another way I'll show you right away here is I have done this before too for clients if I couldn't get the window right. But if you draw a wall and put this place image on wall tool, and then you can expand, oh, I've never seen that before. That's cool. You expand that image to whatever size you need, and we'll just bring in this guy from my desktop. And then you can place that behind your windows, and then you can even get, in single select mode, you can get, okay, that was weird. You can delete your wall and then move your image wherever you need to. So you don't need that wall connected to it, but to bring it in, you initially do. And then you can mess with the scale of that, place it behind your windows. So that's another way to do a background in model space. All right. So obviously this space is also very accessorized. This started as an actual project, and the client did have a pretty good base. They were in a loft like this with brick walls. I just took it to a whole nother level to practice for the rendering competition. So I even added more windows here. A lot of things I like to do in any rendering I do is bring in plants, and I bring a lot of those in through SketchUp Warehouse. I will caution you, I did a rendering for a client a few weeks ago. I brought in like a planted plant from SketchUp, and the client asked for pricing on it. And I was like, we could find something similar, like Crate and Barrel or something. So if it's a really cool plant, they might ask for pricing on it. So just a warning. But, so yeah, I like to do plants. And then, like I said, do my key accessories like the monitors, paint the monitors. These pictures here I brought in from SketchUp Warehouse. I edited the graphic, rotated them so it looked like they were sitting up instead of just somehow miraculously standing on their own. Simple things like rotating chairs in your renderings I think adds interest. It makes it look like people are working there. Painting any marker board that you have. So on my desktop I have 3 marker board textures that I found on the web, and I just use them for all my renderings. Simple things like painting the TV. So if there's any American Idol fans, this office was watching American Idol winners that day. So yeah, just really outfitting the space, just making it look like people are using it. Any other questions for this space? So I went to 3D SketchUp Warehouse and Googled exposed ceiling.
So it's all one piece?
Yep, it's all one piece. I don't remember the exact size it came in at, but I edited the graphic, stretched it to what I needed to. And that's why it's coming beyond the space a little bit. When I had it stretched a little bit more in, it didn't look right to me, so I just stretched it to make it look right, cropped that part out, and that's the way I did that. And then the other materials, like I Googled like a seamless brick, and there's a few seams in it, but it's okay. And then bringing that into Material Lab, manipulating the material, brightness, reflection, however you need it to, and then painting your walls. Okay, so this is how I set up this space. Yes?
What did you use for the moss texture? Did you make that or did you find that?
This one here.
On the ceiling, the
Oh, so that's actually like a really rustic wood.
Oh, I can tell that was wood.
So,
That's cool.
yeah, so I just, again, brought that in through Material Lab, painted it.
Have you tried double clicking on the screen instead of painting them? Your monitor?
Oh, I do double click.
Okay, you said paint.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. I was like,
Nope.
it's easier than that.
Yep, double click. So I paint everything else, and then monitors and marker boards, double click, and bring in your image. Yes. All right. So let's go into Photo Lab. And this is where I've been really struggling with delay on my mouse click, so I'm sorry if you get dizzy. Okay, that'll do. So again, I still use product lighting. I just haven't gotten used to realistic lighting yet. But I still think product lighting works really well in enclosed spaces also. So again, those are my simple presets, and then I'll bring it into advanced. And I always keep render mode at natural light. I just think it provides the most realistic rendering. And obviously you won't deal with 360s unless you're doing a 360 rendering. And then contour too, but another way to do contour is if you just do like the contour preset, and then I used to use normal before I learned about product lighting and natural light, but now I keep it at natural light. Render quality, I typically keep it at the default of 80, especially with these rectangular area lights. Sometimes that can cause a little fuzziness in your rendering. So if you do, for some reason, need to bring your render quality down to produce faster renderings, I would try to keep that 50 or above, just so you aren't getting all that graininess. And then all of these settings under here, typically I keep them as is since I like the defaults. But if you do, for some reason, need to change any of them, you can see when I'm moving this dial that a lot of those numbers are changing. So the things I like to point out is I always keep HDR on, and then anti-alias, if you bring that down too far, your anti-alias will go down, and that also just produces graininess in your rendering. But if you turn your alias up really high, then your render time is really long as well. So just keeping that at a happy medium. Just keep that as the default. Glossy effects I keep as the default, because even though you can't see it, everything has a little bit of reflection, and you don't want your rendering to look super flat. And under global illumination, I don't really know what any of that means, so I just keep it as is. Image dimensions, again, I like to keep my default at more of that rectangular. And then it comes in as looking like this, but if you click on show more, it shows these bigger image sizes. I haven't rendered in a while with these. I think they're good, if you are projecting on a large monitor or something, that would be a good quality to have. Again, it's going to increase your render time. View mode, so I typically keep it at normal because I don't need to do anything else with it, but if for some reason your client needs to see their whole floor of workstations and just the panels rendered, you can click panels, and it will only show the panels. I'm not going to click it because everything will go away because I don't have panels in this drawing. But if I clicked on architecture, it takes away everything else and just keeps my architecture if I, for some reason, need to render that. Levels, so if you're working in a drawing that has multiple levels, this is where you would choose which level to view to render. Camera. So this is that same thing. I like to keep it between 5'6" and 8 feet, just so it looks like a little bit more realistic view. Okay, I'm so sorry. Okay, clipping. So typically I use crop tool in post-processing over clipping, but if you do need to clip out things, kind of works like that, just disappearing your whole space. I actually learned something in my last session. If you need to do a bird's eye view, however, it's fantastic. Instead of freezing your ceiling, you can turn on clipping, and then you can get that bird's eye view. So I learned something today too. Perspective. So you can see here, I actually rendered this without this end wall on, and I found that it didn't affect the quality of my rendering or the lighting I had in here. So if you do need to freeze a wall to get a good perspective into your space, that's okay. But if you do run into a situation where you're zooming out to get a good view and all of a sudden you're in the middle of a wall, zoom in a little bit more and then use this perspective tool, and that will allow you to see more or less in front of you without backing up into a wall. And then with elevation, I just alter with my mouse over here. Pitch, that's where your head is looking. So if you're looking down or up, I just always keep it at the default so it's looking straight ahead. I'm actually not going to touch on lighting and shadows until my next space, since I didn't use that for this one. I used spotlights instead of sunlight, so I'll touch that with what I've learned on my next space. But same thing with the typical renderings, ghost rendering, outline overlay. I didn't need to ghost anything in this rendering, so I kept my outline overlay on, and since I invented my own way to do my background, I didn't deal with background either. So I will touch on that a little bit later. Let's see. Well, let's test that on my next drawing where I actually have ceiling lights. Remind me if I forget. Okay. So let's say I practiced this rendering and it was all dandy and I want to save that preset. You can click on this yellow arrow here, add custom preset, and I'm just going to name this CE Conference 2. So what I really like about the presets is back in your simple mode, those presets will save. So if I really like the way that turned out for this drawing and I'm working on a future drawing, I can start with that preset and then I can edit it as adjusted per drawing. Another thing with presets is they are shareable files. However, the tricky thing with that, so open custom presets folder here. So here's all my custom presets I've made. The only tricky thing here is whoever you share it with is going to have to copy and paste it into that exact drawing path on their computer because it's proprietary to each user. So that's my photograph setup, presets there. Post-processing. So again, I kind of mess with the same ones here with exposure, brightness, contrast. I can show you, I don't have a lot of drawings where I need to deal with focus and blur, but it is an option. So if you check that and you set focus, oh, sorry, it has to be rendered first. So let me show you that in my next drawing, because I don't want to waste your time making this render. It didn't stick, but. Hopefully a different rendering in my other drawing stuck so I can show you what more of these features do. But with post-processing, once you get it all set up, you can also add custom preset there and share that with other people. Okay. Just want to make sure I didn't miss anything. So I'm going to go into my other space here. So this one is a lot simpler. I just created it quick to show you different things I've done. So this one I actually used a ceiling from CET, and again that's in the lighting tab, and that's an extension, so if you don't have that, go to Marketplace and download that. And I just use this fluorescent ceiling here. And when you bring that in, it's going to have default lights already stuck to it, and you're going to see that grid, and you're going to see that acoustic tile underneath. And then you can mess with the settings in the green box. So whether you want your lights to glow, I think you should. You can mess with the elevation there. You can also, anything like this, page up, page down for elevation. Okay, so solid is if I'm looking at the top. I usually like to uncheck solid just so I can still see what's going on in my drawing, but as you can see in this space, the light fixtures are still showing. Or you can just hide your ceiling altogether. And then the beams. So when it brings in that default grid, you can take that grid off if you don't like those. So it still has that fluorescent or that acoustic tile look. So ceilings, architecture, anything like that, you can paint. So my ceiling in here, you can see I just painted it like a nice white. Tile width and tile depth. I always like to come down here and switch, you can switch to can lights, the double tile, whatever you need there. And then with the row spacing and column spacing, that will determine like how many lights are in your space. For perimeter rows and perimeter columns, I like to keep this at 0 or 1, and you can see it spread out my lights closer to the perimeter, and I just think that helps with that overall lighting coming down onto your walls in your renderings. So I always like to put that at 0 or 1, depending on where they land. And then this Use Area Light tab. So this rectangular area light, so like I said, that produces the most realistic light, and so that's why this option is here for the ceiling, and I always keep that checked just to be able to use that area light and make it as realistic as possible. So that's my ceiling. Another thing I did that I said I've learned differently with these rectangular area lights, sometimes with my renderings I found that just outlining the whole space with that area light, sometimes it just didn't come out as even, which you think it would, but it was just a trial and error with certain renderings. So this time I found it worked best to use just a kind of a vignette of those lights producing more, and then it just produced more of that light and it produced more of a balance coming down. Other lighting I did in this one, I actually did use the window lights, but because the windows are much larger here, I found that even bringing it down to 100 was a lot. So this, I think it's like really low, like 14, but it still just provided that a little bit of glow coming in without being too overexposed. And then, so like I said for the last rendering, having that wall frozen I found it didn't affect the quality of my rendering. This one, I found that having the wall frozen made the outlines of my rendering super dark. So I actually just put a spotlight in here, and that just produced more glow coming from that side of the rendering. And again, turned my shadows off so it wasn't obvious where that was coming from. So same type of accessories in this space, painted or double-clicked on the whiteboards and the monitors and put those textures on. Painted my window frames black just to provide more of that contrast. And yeah, so this one's a lot simpler, but let's go into PhotoLab. Shoot, it didn't stick. Okay. That's all right. Maybe this one did. Okay. It looks like this because I was playing around in the last session. So I'm going to talk about post-processing now, but before that, I should talk about photograph setup with this space. So again, in my simple mode, started with product lighting, went to advanced, and then I kept a lot of these settings the same here, but the ones I wanted to focus on for you guys for this one was lighting and shadows. So I actually think sun for natural light is the most natural and most realistic. I haven't played around a lot with this realistic light, but hopefully it provides realistic light like its name. But sun for natural light here. So the first two, the total and the sunlight, always come in at a default of 50. Through experience, I found that that's always just way too bright to start with, especially since I have other lights in my model space already. So I always just bring total down to about 20, 25, and then I'll play with it, trial and error. And that sunlight, so you can see that I have preview shadows checked, and if I don't, you can't see where that sun is coming in. So that's useful to always have checked. And then you can play around with the sundial, decide where you want that light to come in at. And since I don't have that back wall on for this case, I want to make it look like it's coming in from the other side. So you can see the shadows casting this way, and that's what that black line is on the sundial. That's your shadows casting. And no matter where you are, or no matter how you move about that space, that sundial is going to move with you. So that's based off of where you are in the drawing. The camera, so if I'm doing like a 360 rendering, I always want to turn the camera off, because what the camera does, it just is that flash coming off of your camera when it produces that rendering. So for still renderings like this, I think it can be useful if you do need that extra boost of light. But if you're doing a 360, you don't want these flashes in all 6 of your renderings that are stitched together. Emissive background here, so typically I do keep that checked. What that does is if you have a lot of things in the drawing that are next to each other that have similar materials, this emissive background will just make those a little bit more apparent, just define those areas a little bit better so the materials aren't blending all together. And then if you mess with the sunlight total here, you can see how much more subtle that sunlight got. Any questions on lighting and shadows part? Yes, let's do that. Okay, so he reminded me to clip the ceiling to see if that worked this way. Oh. So that light will still, you just can't see it. So you still can't see the ceiling, but the ceiling will still produce that light into your, no? Okay, okay. Yeah, okay. Right, like it took away the ceiling, so that lighting from the ceiling is not gonna come down. Yeah. Yeah, so you'll have your natural sunlight coming in, so hopefully that will balance out, but good little trial and error. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about with preset for this space is the background. So again, I have my outline overlay on. So background, CET has predefined colors in here for you to use. If you want your own funky color, you can bring that in here. Or if you want to do a panorama, you can bring in a photo. So I would suggest just Googling like high resolution panorama, and then if you have like a favorite city or anything like that, Google that. CET does have some defaults in here. I typically bring in my own. So let me show you the rendering I did. So you can see that background there and how it expands to all the windows. And in a perfect world, I would mess with the lighting a little bit better to make it, I would warm the lighting up, make it look more of like that sunset sun or sunrise. Okay, but once you find your panorama that you like, you can import it here. And let me click on this one. Okay, so when it comes in, it's super grainy. You don't really know what you're looking at, and it's around your entire space. So, which can look a little scary, but good thing there's two other ways you know now to make backgrounds. So this is where you can mess with the scale X, Y, and typically I bring that scale up to start with, and you can kind of see what that's doing in the background. So what it did is, instead of one big panorama, it just stitched them all together, but it looked a little bit better, so that's a better start. So let's bring maybe, and I found this is really touchy, so if this takes you a little bit to figure out, I mean, don't get discouraged. Clearly, I can't even figure it out right now. I've never tried that. I mean, if you photoshopped two pictures together to create one big panorama, then it would have that view on the other side. But I've never tried that. Yeah, or you could paint, yeah, do two walls on each side and make those backgrounds. But the panoramas, I've never tried that, so I wonder if the stitching would work. Yes?
Also, if you use the two-wall trick instead, you can literally go to your client's site on Google Maps, look across the
True.
screen, snip it, and then click on both of those.
Yeah. Yes, that's a good tip. So she said, for those of you in the back, if you do use like the wall trick for both sides of your rendering or three sides or whatever it is, you can go to Google Maps where your actual client space is, clip their view, and paint that on the walls. Okay, so that's a little bit better. Obviously, it looks like I'm super high up in this building, but you can at least see the top of the buildings there and how it comes around to these sides. And it's always gonna look a little bit more fuzzy before you render it. But as you can see with this one, it cleared up a little bit. All right. So that's how I preset the things that are different, the lighting and shadows and the background for this one compared to the other one. And we'll just, this one looks super, I think this was one before this was one of my first trial ones. For some reason it stuck around for me, so we'll just work with it. Like that's a different background that I was playing around with. So bringing down the exposure defines those shadows more, but as you can see, it darkened the whole space. So in contrast to that, I always turn up my brightness just to counteract that exposure being down low. And then if I need more definition between my different objects, that's where you can use your contrast. Saturation. The only time I really use saturation is to turn it all the way down if a client hasn't picked finishes and I don't want to spend the time applying different finishes. You can render it and then turn down the saturation so it's black and white, and then that gives a little bit more substantial visual than just a contour rendering. Oh no. Okay, I'll just come down here. Okay, and then so for temperature and tint, the only time I mess with this is if I do have like a rendering that does have more of like a sunset background. I can turn up the temperature and tint just to create a little bit warmer feel in the space. Because you don't want super bright daylight coming down from your CET lights and then you have this really beautiful sunset in the background. It doesn't make sense. Focus and blur. Okay. Sorry, some of these settings are still from the last one and like what's going on. Okay. So I don't typically use focus and blur, and this isn't going to be a great example because the drawing isn't super big, but if you do for some reason need to focus or blur something out, you just hit set focus, you click, and then you can use your scroll and your mouse to control how much of that is going to be focused or blurred. So let's just start there. And then if you mess with the amount, So you can see everything in my forefront blurred out a little bit. So again, I think this is going to work better for larger drawings, but just wanted to show you kind of how that works. Vignette, so this also helps, so I put that spotlight in to help with the outline of my rendering. Vignette is also a great tool you can use if you need to make the edges a little bit darker, oops, or lighter. That's way too bright, but that's where you can mess around with that. And then feather just creates, I don't use feather, but if you want to, that's cool. Noise, I don't use noise. It looks like it's printed in a newspaper, so if that's the look you're going for, here you go. That's what you can do there. But I typically don't use that. Crop I use all the time. The one thing I will say with crop is if you have like a really high resolution image, and if I crop this down, whoops, all the way over here, I lost the resolution of my image. So if that was, okay, so let's bring this back. So one thing you can do to get around that is like zooming in first, and then you have like the same resolution that you're seeing on the screen, and then you can crop. I typically don't run into that situation because I don't crop that much out of a rendering, but just a little warning there. Watermark, our company doesn't use watermarks, but if yours wants to, that's where you can bring in your company logo or whatever type of watermark you want to put on. So CET has a default one in there, and then you can mess with the scale and opacity and where that falls on your drawing. Cartoon sketch. So one thing I do want to point out, and for some reason, this test rendering I didn't turn on the outline overlay, so that's not on right here. But with that ceiling grid, I got rid of the grid, I painted it white, but if I were to turn my outline overlay up, that grid comes back. So to get around that, you can do, in this cartoon sketch, you can turn the line, let me just turn it up all the way so you can see, but you can turn that line up so it still outlines a little bit, but it doesn't bring those ceiling grids back. So just working around different tools, making things work, and then if you need to like white out your space, like make a coloring book, that's cool. Sketchiness. So I think this, like the post-processing, a lot of it, it's just your style of rendering, how you want to present it. So you can do all of that there. And again, you can set up the custom presets in post-processing. All right. Any questions that I can answer so far? Yes. If you have like a ceiling feature you want to show on your floor. So like what type of feature are you like picturing? And then you want the grid to come down on the floor? Is it dropped a little bit from like the ceiling? So I would maybe start with like a rectangular area light over your detail, and then maybe whatever that floor is, turn up that reflection on the floor, and then that should help with that. Her question is if you had like a cool ceiling detail that you wanted like shadowed on the floor, showing up on the floor, would you achieve that? Just off the top of my head, that's what I would start with. But any other questions? And then your panorama does show up in this space, which is kind of scary. So I just always like go back to a predefined or something, but and it'll go off. Okay. 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 Yes. other questions? Okay. Thank you, guys.